Hi, everyone. End of the day. I'm the Academic Dean of the Fletcher School, Professor of International Law. Honored to be chairing this final panel. Some of the panelists have to leave at 5:30 sharp, so I apologize in advance. We're under a very strict time constraints, so I'm going to ask the panelists to spend closer to 10 minutes than 15 minutes in their remarks to give some time at the end for some questions and answers, and then we'll do what we can to make sure that we wrap things up by 5:20, 5:25, so those who have to leave can leave. The questions that this panel was asked to address, the overarching question is, can public policy schools bridge the gap, the academic policy gap? And there are a couple of sub-questions there. The first one is, there are a number of subject matters, policy-relevant scholarship, area studies, interdisciplinary approaches, where public policy schools might have a comparative advantage in the marketplace of ideas. To what extent are those schools exploiting those advantages? Will they persist in the current economic and political climate? The panelists are not restricted to commenting on those questions, but that's something that at least some of them have thought about a bit. I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to add one observation. I wasn't here for a good part of the day, so it could be that we have talked about this a little bit, but I was struck at the beginning by Peter Fever pointing out that the issue and the critique and the questions about the relevance of policy schools tend to be oriented towards national security questions, and the people who are sometimes concerned in the policy world about this tend to be in national security positions, and they tend to be in fairly senior positions. And so a sort of question that I hope we can think about a little bit is to whether this can be generalized beyond national security issues, beyond Washington, and beyond senior levels. Is there a broader problem here in other areas, other fields, and in other parts of the world? Because I do think that public policy schools like Fletcher and the others don't imagine that the only audience, the only policy audience that we're interested in influencing are senior national security figures in Washington. But with that, I will throw begin the panel presentations, and I suspect that I should proceed in the order in which people are listed on the program, and so we'll begin with Mia Bloom. Everyone's got the bio, so I won't spend time on the introductions. Mia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Dan and Estefania for all of their hard work and for having me here. I'm going to be speaking, unfortunately, Professor Johnstone's caution about talking about national security in D.C. kind of puts a wrench in the ointment since I work on terrorism. And I was going to actually address issues related to national security in D.C. But I will address other things as well. I wanted to start with an anecdote. This is actually a true story. As I was about to start a new position a few years ago at the School of Public and International Affairs, the School of Public Policy at the University of Georgia, I was asked to detour to Washington, D.C. to brief then General Abizaid. And I was very fortunate to be among a select group of about 25 experts on terrorism and counterinsurgency to discuss the situation in 2006 and what were the prospects for the future. And everyone prepared their PowerPoint presentations, and we had various, from the Beltway as well as from the Academy, ready to discuss our findings with the military. And as we were about to proceed, in the introductory remarks, the general's aide-de-camp started by saying, "And we will not be discussing the war in Iraq." And we all stopped, and he said, "The war in Iraq is off the table." And we said, not only is the war in Iraq the table, it's also the chairs and the plates and the glasses. And that really brought home, as I was studying for comprehensive exams, I remember very clearly, because I liked it, it was a thin book, Stephen Luke's book, Power, A Radical View. And I remembered that the third level of power was control over agenda setting. And I thought this was definitely the execution of power in the ultimate sense, that everybody in the room knew that if you wanted to understand terrorism in Iraq, the situation of the war was fairly important. And right away, whether we were the Academy or we were advisors or policy planners, that was no longer under discussion. So the issue about whether or not the academy and policymakers are able to assist one another to help with regard to issues that I'm most interested in, with terrorism, has been a question that has been posed over and over again, at least since 1991, when Gustavo Gorriti published an essay in Terrorism and Political Violence asking the very same question. And in fact, Rick Macaulay published a whole volume on terrorism and public policy. And what I can tell you is that the findings in the 1990s haven't changed very much. We still very much struggle with the idea that the academy can contribute. And I think it's important to make 3 points. The first point, and some of these have been made earlier today, have to do with the fact that perhaps as academics, we have overestimated our influence on the whole policy debate. I can tell you that one of the issues will be when we do advise, and I have written parts of the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review. I spend a lot of time in DC. I do all the things that Nicholas Kristof says that academics don't, TED Talks, and do the public intellectual thing since coming to Boston, because I'm in Boston now and not in the middle of central PA. I've done 53 media interviews just since July, in part because stuff's been going on in the areas with which I have some expertise. So I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and I can still tell you, it is very difficult for me to convince anyone in this room that I've had any impact on policy. So I think part of it is I have to have a slightly smaller ego to think that even my findings, rigorous though they may be, based on actual field work, and I will go to various countries. I will spend time with the Tamil Tigers. I will spend time with various groups to interview individuals to discuss what are their underlying motivations. How can we perhaps influence and limit the scourge of terrorism? Even in situations like that, I have limited influence. And part of it is that as part of the marketplace of ideas, it's important that at least I make my research known. Ariel Marari in 1991, in the same edited volume that Rick Macaulay put together, made the same comment, that it is, and this is a moral imperative that has been discussed previously by people like Mike Desch, that it is incumbent upon someone like myself who has been working on this subject of terrorism for over 25 years, although I've only been popular about 12, so that I make the research known. I make it digestible to the audience who may have a lot of preconceived misconceptions from watching one media outlet or the other. And it's also been important, because I have a background and a degree in Islamic studies, that I make explicit that there isn't that connection that so many people, especially in this area in the last year, have thought that there was an interrelationship between a certain religion and propensity for violence, or a certain ethnic group and propensity for violence, in part because I did a lot of field research in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers, and I can tell you right away that this is a secular group who was very successful at suicide bombing and had nothing to do with any of the monotheistic faiths. So I think part of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is that, is there a requirement that we make our research policy relevant, and how do we know that it is or it isn't? And I think that it is a requirement, but that we can't expect there to be a complete tide change. The example that I gave of General Abizaid is a case in point that, there are certain limitations to policy about having a volte-face. It cannot be all of a sudden, oh, is that the mistake we're making? Well, we're going to change that right away. And I think that that is perhaps somewhat unrealistic an expectation. There is also an unrealistic expectation about the immediate applicability of our research. I think part of the research, the good research on terrorism, I'm not talking about the anecdotes masquerading as data. I'm talking about the detailed, nuanced understanding of terrorism, takes time. I can tell you right now that, it doesn't require someone to have started before 9/11, but people who all of a sudden discovered political violence on the 12th of September didn't have the time and the ability to spend the kind of effort that was required. It would have been impossible within a short period of time to digest all the literature up until 9/11. But since 9/11, according to Andrew Silk's research, there has been a new book on terrorism published approximately every 8 minutes. So even if you're new to the game, studying what I study, it's impossible to master the whole literature, and especially if you're looking beyond one or two particular groups. If you want to fully understand sort of the panoply of political violence, the different kinds of motivations, you need to study groups that maybe are not considered relevant anymore. The provisional IRA is a very good example. And we've got lots of expertise and lots of writing and publications on that. But without revealing any names, a certain expert that I know quite well who's worked on provisional IRA for also over 2 decades was asked to come and testify before Congress about terrorism and the psychology of terrorism. And among the things that he was going to discuss was to look at Al-Qaeda, but also to look at IRA. And DC said, oh, no, we're not interested in the IRA. We've resolved that problem. And I think that it's this very short-term, narrow lens that has been some of the problems in terms of making the academy relevant. Let me get to 1 or 2 other points that have been raised earlier today that I just wanted to be clear. As far as we've talked about interdisciplinarity, the kinds of research that I personally, now, so I have the luxury of saying this because I'm post-tenure, but the kinds of research that I now feel can make the best contributions are not just multi-method, but they're also interdisciplinary. I think there is so much that we can learn from people in economics, from law, from sociology, from anthropology, and the study of religion. The problem is that the stovepiping that we see in many of the schools doesn't really permit us to draw from the theoretical wealth that is available in other disciplines. And I'm hoping that places like Fletcher or SPIA at the University of Georgia or other public policy schools are able to actually do things that maybe political science departments cannot, which is encourage the kind of interdisciplinarity that not only will make for richer and more nuanced research, but also I can tell you from the funding side of it, funders in DC want to fund research that's interdisciplinary. One of the most interesting projects that I was grateful to be a part of was a project on mimicry and deception among terrorist groups. And one of the things, I worked with Dr. John Horgan, and one of the things that Dr. Horgan did, as he put together an interdisciplinary team, and we had a political scientist and a psychologist, he brought on an entomologist, because nobody understands mimetic behavior better than people who study bugs. And the government loved the idea of not just bridging social sciences with the hard sciences, but deriving some of our testable hypotheses from the study of entomology to be able to say, what are the offensive and defensive camouflage techniques in the animal kingdom, and can we learn from that to the study of terrorism? And in fact, we did, and it was a fabulous project. So the public policy schools, I think, are offering an opportunity. What we want to ensure is that the PhD students that emerge from the public policy schools are taken just as seriously. And so I think that perhaps one of the things that is incumbent upon the faculty is maybe you need to engage in a bit more mentoring. That in public policy schools, to ensure the huge success of our students, we need to help professionalize them a little bit more than is being offered in the departments. Because the departments, is kind of a baptism by fire. You have your comprehensive exams, and then it's like having survived the Grand Rapids, and now you're in a little boat, and all you see around you is a sea of blue, and what direction you go in is up to you. I think with public policy schools, while we encourage the interdisciplinarity and we encourage the relevance, we need to ensure that the students have the best possible advantages at their disposal by being a little bit more involved, involving them on grants, involving them in publications, and really mentoring them. So I've run out of time, and I had many pages of notes, but I'm happy to answer anything in Q&A. And what I will say is that I agree with Dean Johnstone. It's important that the relevance argument be discussed not just with regard to national security, but with regard to environmental politics, with regard to poverty, with regard to all these other issues where we need to be relevant, not just in terrorism, but we need to be relevant in general.
Very nice segue into our next speaker, Kelly Sims Gallagher, whose field of expertise is in the environment and a certain part of the world. Kelly.
Okay, thanks. So I am going to break my remarks into three parts. I want to talk about incentives in the schools themselves. I want to talk about the funding for this kind of work, and then the level of individual commitment that's required to actually bridge the gap. And I'm here to tell you I have bridged the gap. I can think of four cases where I concretely changed policy. And these are going to be really different from what we've talked about in the national security field. But I worked on the development of fuel efficiency standards for automobiles in China. I worked on the first CO2 performance standards for automobiles in the United States. I wrote a memo that resulted in the creation of the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which is a virtual R&D center. And based on a paper that I had done with a colleague, a sales tax rebate for hybrid cars was changed. So I can think of these four examples where I actually had that influence. And they are among the things I'm most proud of, to be honest with you. They're very concrete. I know I made a difference. And as I was reflecting on, okay, why was I able to do these things? What happened in these cases? They were all based on sound scholarly research. 3 of the 4 occurred when I was teaching only 1 class a year. So going back to my time point from earlier today. And they all have occurred around issues I feel really passionate about. So I think that I had a level of commitment to persist and see them through. That would have not, it just wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been willing to go the extra mile over and over and over again. So let me just talk about what I think are the 2 main problems within the schools themselves. And I should say, I have a sample of 2, really. I've worked at, as we already embarrassingly noted, I've worked at the Kennedy School and the Fletcher School. But they're 2 very different environments, so I actually can reflect a little bit. But I think the 2 main problems are time for faculty, and then money, and the kind of incentive structures within schools and how they fund themselves. So in one school, and I'm not going to say which is which, there was a strong emphasis on external service, as it's called. And it's actually a formal tenure criterion in one of the schools. So external versus internal, it was actually explicitly separated. It is explicitly separated. And I think it was made possible by lighter teaching loads than in many other schools. And a culture where buying out classes was encouraged so that you bring in more research dollars in order to be able to buy out the classes and bring in more sponsored research, which helps the school because they're getting overhead on the sponsored research. I think in the other school it's certainly permissible, but it's harder due to a heavier teaching load and a more student-oriented culture. But in both cases, the emphasis is very strongly on scholarly work pre-tenure. So while it can be policy relevant, it must pass muster in terms of academic rigor. And so it's really an add-on rather than an either. I mean, it's not, what am I trying to say? It's not an or, like you could just do the policy research if it lacked, if you hadn't also published it in really top-tier journals or university presses. So it's an and. It's something extra. And therefore, as I was talking to a couple people in the break, it's an extra thing that one must do if you want to engage in policy. On the funding side, being in both schools made me realize the really different sort of financial model for the schools. So for the schools, they rely on tuition for revenue, endowment, sponsored research, executive education, and gifts. I mean, I think those are the main categories. And in my experience, these two schools differed in one really significant way, which was endowment. And that really changes the picture, because if you're not so reliant on tuition dollars, you're not going to be so strongly motivated to be so student-oriented. Not that we don't love students, but it just, it changes the emphasis, I think, a little bit, and makes it more possible to engage more on the research side. Personally, I've been a pretty successful fundraiser and have raised multiple $1 million in sponsored research funding over the past 10 years in both schools. But one trend I've seen that really worries me in my domain is that foundations have strongly pulled back in policy research. And so for the first time in my academic career, I don't have any foundation funding. Instead, I have a government grant, individual gifts, and corporate general support. And I find this like amazing, because when I started, I was 100% foundation. And I had a foundation that had funded a very large program completely end the program because they said nobody in Washington wants to listen to good ideas. So I really think this is an interesting, challenging problem. Will the corporate, sector pick up where foundations are leaving off, or who's going to pick up, to support this type of research, because someone has to pay for the time, right, somehow. In terms of the individual level, I think tenure track faculty have to be pretty big risk takers to engage in policy relevant research, especially if they're interdisciplinary, which I think you need to be if you're going to be assessing policy. I didn't quite realize how risk-taking I had been until my tenure letters went out, and I realized there was probably no one who looked like me in my evaluation letters. They were all disciplinarians in one way or another, and I realized how risky I had been. But on the other hand, there's high reward to that risk, so I don't regret what I did, but I think a lot of people aren't willing to tolerate the risk. I also think it requires a high level of commitment, because if it is an an add-on activity, then it's something that has to be done largely after hours. I actually do go to work every day and spend all day, every day in meetings and teaching and working with students, and so this sort of thing is something that is done late at night or early in the morning and on weekends. And then I think the last thing is that you have to be willing to cede the credit. So those 4 successes that I think I've had, I'm not sure are associated with me, though I know that the people who really know I was the one who did that work, but the credit had to go to a lot of other people. And so that's another hard thing, that you have to be willing to cede that credit, but be content with that quiet satisfaction that you actually made a big difference. So let me just conclude by saying I think most of the APSIA schools really do want to be policy relevant, but a lot of practical considerations hinder their ability to do so. I think the funding model is problematic, especially for those schools heavily reliant on tuition without big endowments. Not only for research, but also for that crucial outreach phase that we've been talking so much about today. The sheer demands on faculty members' time, tension between teaching, internal service, external service, research, et cetera, and literally finding the time to go do those briefings, get on the plane to go to Washington and spend the day there is hard. But on the other hand, those people who start to do it, I think, will get hooked, because I personally love crossing that bridge, as I think of it, the U.S. Air Shuttle to Washington, or the United flight to Beijing for me, because I do a lot of work in China. And I always come back from those trips to Washington or Beijing totally charged up and motivated to do more. And as I said, those achievements are some of my proudest moments, and they really make me feel like I've accomplished something. So I think our challenge is to figure out how to bring people into the fold to take those risks, both personal and financial.
Great.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Kelly. Next speaker is Jim Goldeyer, who spent a lot of time thinking about this in various capacities, including most recently as Dean of the School of International Service at American. Jim.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Thanks so much for inviting me. I could have been like your dean, and I guess who's in meetings all day and isn't able to be here, but great to get away for a day. So I also, like Kelly, have sort of three main themes. One, sort of what we can do as public policy schools, or in my case, International Affairs School, free from disciplinary constraints, which I think there are many things that we can do. But I also want to say, second, the kind of constraints that we also struggle with, and that mainly has to do with the whole evaluation process of faculty and what we value. And then third, I want to close by talking about who our audience must be, and we already heard Zeynep talk about the way in which the higher leadership at her university has been so supportive. I believe presidents and provosts are keenly attuned to this issue, given the pressure they're under to show that their institutions have a value to society. So I think that that's the audience we need to reach. So I'm going to give some examples from the school I know best, which is the School of International Service, where I've been dean for 3 years, in terms of sort of thinking about what we can do that can't be done in a conventional political science department, for example. Even though I was fortunate enough prior to coming to AU to be in a political science department at George Washington University, which did value these types of things and allowed me to do a lot of things I probably wouldn't have been able to do in other political science departments. So I'm very grateful for that. I think it's really incumbent on us as international affairs schools, and we try to do this in SIS, to really force ourselves to talk about, what are the big questions we should be asking? What are the important questions? I'm always struck by something that Steve Van Evera has often talked about, which is that the natural sciences are really built around problems, and you see shifts in terms of what you even call departments depending on the new problems that arise and new fields that arise. Whereas in the social sciences, we tend to be organized by disciplines. As Dean of International Affairs School, I have a school that doesn't have any departments in it. We're all mixed up together, different folks, political scientists, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, geographers, global health experts, communications, other people, all within the same environment. We're able to hire people that traditional departments can't, just because of the way those departments have gone. In the last year, we've hired an economist who has a big part of what he does is he's an economic historian, and works, for example, doing a project looking at Japan in the 19th century, opening to the outside world as a natural experiment in globalization. And then we also just hired a diplomatic historian, works on Cold War history, human rights issues. And, if history departments aren't going to hire diplomatic historians, I feel like, hey, I should go out there and get them into SIS, because they're, you can, as I said to my provost, we can get whoever we want, because the history departments don't want to compete. Good for us. So, it also enables students to, as is the case at a school like Fletcher, enables students to take classes from scholars who are working in multiple disciplines, and they can study issues from very different perspectives. If you want to study global health issues at SIS, you can take courses taught by a sociologist, a geographer, a political scientist, as well as specialists in public health development and communications. Scholars in the international affairs schools, public policy schools, tend to have both a functional expertise and a regional expertise. We need people who can teach stuff about, places. And so we have people working in international development or working in conflict resolution who also have an expertise in Africa or Asia, or particularly, China, South Africa, particular countries or particular regions, which is extremely important. just thinking, I was just thinking, preparing for this about, taking an issue like climate change and thinking about the school and thinking about the different perspectives, having scholars working on UN issues, the multilateral efforts to address climate change, scholars working from a humanities perspective, looking at sort of the collective suffering felt by regions most affected by climate change, others looking at trade agreements, international laws, others looking at the volatility of resource provision, flood vulnerability in poor urban or peri-urban areas, others looking at food security, and one scholar now looking at geoengineering. In terms of policy relevance, I'll just add on, a couple examples of people doing work outside the national security field that I think is very exciting. And, my job as dean is really to try to make sure that these scholars, I'm going to mention 2 young scholars in terms of what they work on, and I won't mention them by name, but you can look them up on the website. But, my job is to support them and to help them be able to be successful. I have one who looks at the social networks of young Tanzanian men and how these networks make them more vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, and has now applied this research with some external funding to study the social networks of young men in Washington, D.C., a city in which 1 in 20 adults is thought to be HIV positive. I mean, this is very important work. Another who's a cultural geographer who looks at agricultural biodiversity, food security, seeds, and agricultural cooperatives, and has done a lot of work on the Farm Bill and brought people together at SIS around the Farm Bill, which is terrific, especially given all that went into producing the Farm Bill. So there's a lot we can do, and yet we still, like the conventional departments, have some limitations, and I think you've got people trying to disseminate their research to try to engage the policymaking community, and the question then is, well, what kind of credit do they get? What happens when they come up for tenure or they come up for promotion, or even just their annual merit review, and how are they viewed within the process? What happens when they come through across my desk and then I send it on above me? The way in which we measure scholarly productivity and impact does still slight the policy-relevant scholar. It does discourage tenure-track faculty from pursuing policy-relevant research. Media outreach, op-eds, blogs, these other things typically are seen as a nice add-on, but not central to the mission of what the scholar should be doing. And the universities typically privilege certain types of measurements, most of which are counting citations in academic peer-reviewed journals. I mean, some of these, they don't even, count books, really focused very specifically on that. I want to say just 2 words about the time issue with respect to that, and want to use something that someone has said we run through the Bridging the Gap project that I help run, and that Carnegie Corporation has provided significant funding for. We run an International Policy Summer Institute in the summer, 1-week summer institute for faculty members who want to become more engaged, more policy relevant, and reach a wider audience. And it's a lot of hands-on stuff, so blogging, op-ed writing, media training, and so on. A number of people here have spoken, Henry, Ben, Dan, Mike Desch is coming in June, Mike Horowitz. We invite Peter Fever every year, but he never is able to make it. But one of these days he's going to come. John Sides, who's Henry's colleague at GW and also on the Monkey Cage, has noted in our discussion about blogging that, department chairs aren't asking people, why they spent 2 hours the night before watching House of Cards or reruns of The Big Bang Theory, and yet, well, why did you spend 2 hours blogging? So, in terms of what people do, with the 24 hours a day that they have, why should they be challenged for spending some of that time blogging when nobody's asking them, why they're playing on the university softball team or whatever. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind because people can be very productive in traditional ways and still do all these other things, which are really, I think, enhancing their work. And just also mentioned, very excited that Oxford University Press has now agreed to a new Bridging the Gap book series that Bruce Jentleson, Steve Weber, and I are going to be the co-editors for, that's designed to produce policy-relevant work. I want to close on this issue of the basically going big, because I love coming to these things, and it's great to see Dan and Mike Tierney and Peter and Henry and Mike Horowitz. And, we do this and Steve, we do this several times a year. It's great. John's sister, we got to go. There's a big audience there, and it's the presidents and provosts. These are people who are increasingly anxious about demonstrating to state legislatures, donors, parents, students, that their institutions are relevant to society, that they have faculty who are making a difference. What are they questioned about? What are they challenged about? They're not challenged about the faculty member who's out there doing important policy-relevant research. They're challenged by the faculty member who has an audience of 3, who's writing, what do they get picked on? They get picked on for people who are writing on really narrow, small topics that nobody cares about and who have this, position. Why does that person have tenure at your university? The question is insignificant. They're not asked about people who are making a difference, or asking significant questions and having significant impact. And I think that that's the audience. They're frustrated by the faculty, senior faculty below, who are putting pressure on people not to do this type of work. And so, they're looking for ways to think about how to do more of this and how to encourage their faculty to do more of this. And I think that really what we should be thinking about, and I hope, for Dan's next conference, that he can bring together presidents and provosts to, think about how to really push their universities to encourage their faculty to be more like my colleagues on either side of me in asking really big, important questions that are going to make a difference.
I'll get to work on getting the black material.
Great, thank you, Jim. Our final speaker, last but not least, of course, is Stephen Del Rosso. Everyone knows Stephen has been thinking about these issues for a long time as well, from his perch as a program director at the Carnegie Corporation. Steve.
Thank you very much. I want to join my panelists in thanking the organizers of this event as well. And I'm just as pleased as Jim Goldeyer to see familiar faces, and would also welcome some unfamiliar faces in addition. As the only program officer, foundation officer, grant maker in the room, I know why I was invited to this conference. It's clearly my magnetic personality, keen intellect, and rapier wit. At least that's what Dan told me when he sent me that last email. Might have.
Very good looking.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Also might have something to do with the fact that, as has been mentioned, the Carnegie Corporation of New York has long been interested in this subject of bridging the gap. In fact, if we go back to the great founder of the corporation, Andrew Carnegie, he was very taken with the notion of the power of ideas. In fact, he had a major idea, abolishing war, that he attempted. Didn't quite succeed, but we're still trying at the corporation. My invitation also might have had something to do with the fact, coincidentally, that we have a major request for proposal aimed at schools, APSIA schools. That, coincidentally, again, is due at the end of this week. And it is on this whole subject of bridging the gap and how APSIA schools can, in fact, try to address that. Now, the question of the panel is, can public policy schools bridge this gap? And I would say, of course, APSIA schools are a subspecies of the larger realm of policy schools, particularly focused on international issues, which the corporation and my program is interested in. A question that's been posed to me is, why APSIA? This seems to be low-hanging fruit. This is where, by definition, these schools are interested in pursuing policy relevance by design. So, what's the issue there that needs to be addressed? And I would say this is part of, as we've heard from the panel, a generic challenge that's faced by the Academy. I'll give you two reasons why we chose APSIA this time around. The first is that this isn't the only thing that we're doing in this field. As Dean Stavridis said earlier, there is no silver bullet. And we're trying to, mix metaphors here, push on any number of doors, fire bullets or whatever, in a number of targets. And a number of the people around this room today, we have been supporting in part in their work, from Dean Goldeyer to John Cisternino to Mike Tierney to Mike Desch and others. So we have no illusions that we have complete right answer, but we feel that we need a multivariate approach, and APSIA schools are part of the issue. Now, the other reason is, as our panelists have so eloquently described, some of the issues and problems and challenges that political science in particular have faced, but the Academy of Social Sciences more broadly, are also faced by APSIA schools. Not only this, we've talked a little about the privileging of method over substance. We've talked about the fact that policy-relevant work is sometimes undervalued in the promotion and tenure system, as Jim Goldeyer has described. The whole notion, you called them practical considerations. I like that little package that also get in the way of APSIA schools perhaps being as policy attuned in terms of these other matters as they could be. So, and also, as other deans have described and faculty, the, no offense to any economist in the room, but the kind of creeping influence of economics and economists into the realm of the policy schools. Not to say that economics doesn't play an important role, but some of the methodologies by some faculty are not deemed to be as helpful as they might. It was disturbing for me to find a quote from Paul Nitze, the late great Paul Nitze, in the mid-90s, who said, now he's the founder, of course, of SAIS, that IR scholarship was not only irrelevant, but counterproductive. That was rather disturbing, because some of us believe that good policy is informed by good ideas, and good ideas are not formed in a vacuum, so that foundations like Carnegie Corporation are interested in promoting the generation of those good ideas. And APSIA schools would appear to be a target of opportunity for some of the reasons I've mentioned. Now, what does this say about the broader field, the broader challenge that APSIA schools face? I would say, I want to quote a great man who once said something that I think is relevant. This is a challenge that the Academy faces, and in particular what APSIA faces. This great man said, knowledge has become so varied, extensive, and minute that it's impossible for any man to know thoroughly more than one small branch. That great man was Andrew Carnegie, and that was in 1902. Now, fast forwarding to the current president of the Carnegie Corporation, Vartan Gregorian, President Gregorian has railed against what he calls the fragmentation of knowledge and the information overload that society has to deal with. And he often quotes Carlos Fuentes, who said that one of the challenges facing modern civilization is to turn information into knowledge and knowledge into wisdom. And I would say the additional challenge for APSIA schools, if I can put it in more prosaic terms, is to turn that knowledge and wisdom into policy and practice, informed policy and practice, good policy and practice. And we all know that the path between idea and policy is a nonlinear one, and that's part of the problem, part of the challenge. So every year I am invited by this institution, and by the way, I'm very happy to be back at my alma mater after graduating 33 years ago, but I'm asked by the Career Office to speak about opportunities in the foundation field, and I somewhat feel badly about that because there are relatively few opportunities, very few career paths that one can take, and people like me tend not to leave once they end up in philanthropy. But that being said, I often describe the challenge faced by APSIA graduates, and I apologize if some of this is dated, because the curricula reforms that have taken place over the last 33 years are very impressive. But those of you of a certain age may recall a movie in the early 90s, a Woody Allen movie called Zelig. And the premise of the movie was this character, Leonard Zelig, would take on the characteristics and personalities of people around him. And I used to describe having an APSIA degree in a good way as a kind of Zelig-like opportunity where you could, because of the experience and the breadth of work done, you could sort of customize your resume, perhaps like no other professional school graduate could. And of course, this Zelig-like quality presents both a challenge and opportunity. We've talked about the challenges. In fact, Aaron Simpson earlier this morning talked about how PhDs are greatly valued these days in DC in the way they weren't in the old days. So this notion of specialization becomes even more important. And this need for specialization, which seems to also be part and parcel of our society, one could argue is an impediment to the kind of broad-based interdisciplinary education that one would get at a place like an APSIA school. But I would argue that this is, while acknowledging it's a challenge, it's also an opportunity because I think, as we've discussed, it's a post-Cold War truism that the very nature of the challenges facing the world are inherently interdisciplinary, and if you're going to try to address them, you need to have at least be conversant across a number of specializations. And I think that's a positive of an APSIA education. You need a holistic perspective on the world, and there are a vast array of opportunities that maybe didn't exist when I graduated from Fletcher in the international affairs field writ large, not only part of the formal policymaking process. So educating this next generation, a number of them are in the room, don't be too alarmed by my Zelig analogy, because I think there's a positive side to that. So let me close by coming back to this request for proposal that, as I mentioned, the due date is actually in a couple of days. I tried something unusual this time around. We don't do many RFPs, but I decided to try what I call a modified version of crowdsourcing. I actually asked APSIA deans for their input into what an RFP might look like. And needless to say, I got a lot of interesting and useful input, and some of it is included in the RFP, some of it isn't, but I'm pleased to learn today that a lot of the themes discussed, even some of the recommendations, have been included in that RFP. And I've been asked by a number of deans, what we really want over and above the RFP. And all I can say is that what you see is what you get, and we're interested in promoting the creativity and encouraging the creativity of the institutions that are hopefully submitting applications to the Carnegie Corporation on this theme. And we have no preconceived notions of exactly what we want, and we're hoping by the end of this week to get a lot of creative ideas. We're also, I'll close with saying, we've mentioned the kind of disincentives that exist in the academy in terms of the emphasis put on some of the promotion and tenure decisions where policy relevance is perhaps not as valued as it should be, or writing in foreign affairs or foreign policy. We have quite gingerly added some language in the RFP about special consideration being given to institutions that can demonstrate that policy relevance is valued in promotion and tenure decisions, or that maybe even the tenure clock might stop for particular junior faculty. we have no illusions that, this may even be feasible, because as Jim Goldeyer pointed out, a lot of these decisions are well above even the dean level, and these are institutional, systemic matters. But we wanted to at least put a marker down that, one relatively modest funder up in New York is interested in these issues. So we are quite hopeful that we'll try to push the rock a little bit up the mountain as we can. So thank you again for the opportunity, and stay tuned.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being so disciplined. My only disappointment is I thought we were the only ones who got that RFP, but I guess other schools didn't. We have about 10 or 15 minutes, 15 minutes, I guess, in order to allow people to leave. I will throw the floor open to questions, and if nobody has a question, I will ask one, but I think in the interest of letting people jump in. Michael.
Ches Thurber, I'm a PhD student here at the Fletcher School, and I want to take up from earlier in the morning Michael Desch's opportunity for our question for PhD students to act as the canary in the coal mine. And that is to say, I wonder if you guys, or if generally we might be tackling yesterday's problem. That from my vantage point, it seemed that the comment that Michael Horowitz made this morning might be more on track. That we've seen actually a quite dramatic turn in even the disciplines in their attention towards policy-relevant questions. That looking down Massachusetts Avenue, I see students that are incredibly intelligent and asking really interesting questions that are very policy-relevant. And if academia is already headed in this direction, this poses a different kind of challenge to the policy schools. That is it possible that our students actually are not that differentiated in their ability to ask policy-relevant questions, and if academic departments are coming closer to the policy schools in terms of relevance, what is the value added of the policy focus?
Okay. I'll collect a couple more questions before we turn it over to the panel. I know Mike had one. Okay, Mike and then Mike.
My name is Mike Baskin. I'm a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School. Something that was popping up in a couple comments that I think the APSIA schools could respond to is, and I know at the Fletcher we have a career conference where we go meet our alumni who are in policy positions in the hundreds. And how can schools leverage their networks that literally the people who are in these offices are our alumni from 5 and 10 years ago. And frankly, they know many of our professors, and I think it's at American and SAIS and others, but it's almost like this is our own family problem. We've trained these people, they've gone forward. How do we stay in touch with them, and how do they stay in touch with us? So I'd be interested to get those thoughts, especially as we have PhD graduates who work in CRS, who work in government, so they didn't go into the academy per se, but they've been trained. So thoughts if that's a leverage point for the future.
Okay. One more right here.
Yeah, thanks. This is not just for Steve, although it may sound like it's just for Steve. When people study foreign aid and development, one of the puzzles has always been, how, as a donor, do I get more than $1 worth of development from $1 of foreign aid? And the answer is usually, we get the recipient government to change its institutions, its economic or political institutions, in a way that we believe will lead to more development, based on whatever theory you have of development. It strikes me that Carnegie and other foundations right now are interested in moving the needle. They're trying to intervene in the marketplace of ideas to get more political scientists, more people who study IR, and perhaps people outside of political science to do more policy-relevant research. Full stop. You're trying to change the way that we do our work. It sounds like you made a strategic decision to go after APSIA schools with this RFP, and one of the sort of features you put in it, which I thought was really interesting and novel, it looks a lot like aid conditionality, is that in those APSIA schools that can show that their 10-year standards incorporate this, we're going to try to reward them. Or do you pick schools that already have this and reward them, or is the RFP out there and the idea is this will get schools to actually change their current standards? And so I think other foundations are still struggling with this. They think it's the way you started your premise, which is the APSIA schools are already supposed to be doing this. We'll get more bang for our buck by trying to shift the behavior of political scientists within political science departments. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'd be really interested to hear your thinking, but also other people's theories about the way you get more individuals, departments, and universities to shift into the direction that you want, so they're on Carnegie's strategy.
All right, one more from Dan.
Sorry, prerogative, but I want to touch on something that Kelly mentioned, which in particular is the notion that if you want to have impact on policy, you have to be willing to cede credit, which resonates and sounds very true to me. But then this becomes the question of within the academy, and for that matter, more broadly, we're talking about the extent to which the academy can influence the marketplace of ideas. If it turns out that the academy, in order to have that influence, paradoxically, you have to deny that you're influencing. That really complicates things like measuring impact or things like that. So I'm wondering if anyone on the panel could discuss that problem.
Dan, I'm very proud of my work.
All right, good. We have 4 questions. Why don't I just let the panelists pick and choose which they want to answer, and we'll start in the order that people spoke. Mia, do you want to go first?
Okay, just very, very quickly. I think that in terms of Mike's question, I think that there are 2 different tracks for the Fletcher PhD. There is the academic track. It is available to you. There are enough Fletcher PhDs who are academicians, very successfully so, but perhaps not at Harvard and Yale, perhaps at, a different place, perhaps in Europe, perhaps in Israel, perhaps in places where they're not, strictly disciplinarians, Catholic about, you have to be of this particular methodological approach and publishing in this particular publication. So I think that is open to you. I think the networking, though, is always going to be, you have to be very entrepreneurial about it. You have to put yourself out there, and it will be individually rather than the school being able to create an atmosphere. They can create a conducive atmosphere for networking, but at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the individual student who's entrepreneurial, who's got to be hungry and goes the distance and does more than the baseline minimum. And the last point with regard to ceding credit, not responsibility. Someone I was interviewing at a public policy school a few years ago, I was very fortunate to be offered a position, and I retrospectively wonder if my life would have been very different had I not taken it. But they asked me, can you prove beyond a shadow of doubt any of your research translated into actual policy? And the one thing that I knew was the one thing that I had to cede credit for, because it was very controversial, it was very effective, but so basically it was easier for me to say, well, on the margins, we understand better motivations for terrorism and de-radicalization and all these other things. But no, I think sometimes to be effective, we go back to the point that was made earlier by Mike Horowitz, that, discretion is the better part of valor. A lot of times, unless it's a public testimony before a Congress or a Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a lot of the things that we do that are going to have the most impact are the things that we have to keep off the CV, and we have to keep quiet about it. Because, as Peter was saying, you don't get invited back when you go, oh yeah, I briefed the CIA, or I did some work for Centra, and so on and so forth.
Kelly?
Yeah, to Mike Baskett's point, I think that's a great point. Certainly we can be doing a better job, I think, across the board of leveraging our networks. And I think it's maybe just not as systematic as it should be. I think it certainly happens a lot, but maybe not as systematically as possible. On the credit question, I've thought a lot about it, because certainly, this is sort of weird, but for me, I felt like everything I was doing in this domain, I had to do on the QT, both for tenure and for the purposes of getting it done, right? Because, some young American who's drafting fuel economy standards for China, that can't be well known, right? It can't be that it's, I'm doing it in a collaborative way. We are, doing all this, but that's unusual. And so I didn't think that'd be productive from a, tenure committee point of view, nor did I think it would be productive in terms of getting it done. So, but to my foundation point, there was a foundation supporting that work and supporting my time, and they did know, and they could go back to their board and say, look at what we did and look at what we accomplished. And so I think in terms of that funding model, which I think is very important, you can ascribe credit in that regard. I was never more disappointed than when this other foundation said we're ending our program because nobody's interested in, policy relevant research. And so that's a sort of a different problem, right? If you can't convince the boards to keep supporting the work.
Jim?
So the question about the academic departments versus the policy schools with respect to PhDs, and our academic departments moving toward training people for non-academic positions, and you referenced Mike Horowitz. So I hate to speak for Mike Horowitz, but what I heard him say was in his department, small department, they're focused on admitting students who want to go into academia. Yes, that's what you said. Yes. Yeah. So that's not moving toward. In our school, we give a PhD, and the first semester that I was at AU, I had town hall with the PhD students, and I said, how many of you want to go into academia, and how many of you want to be knowledge producers in other areas? And it was about 50-50. So I think that I don't see academic departments moving in that direction because they want to. I see academic departments moving possibly if they have to, because their students aren't getting academic jobs when they finish, and so they have to be more realistic about what the prospects are, but their rankings are based on their students being able to get top jobs in top academic departments, and so that's where they're focused. And I see actually that question and your question as being sort of two sides of the same coin in terms of then how we're evaluating people, and I'll let Steve weigh in more on the Mike Tierney question.
Just to speak for myself for 1 second, the movement I'm talking about is on the research side, not on the student side.
Yeah. Oh, on the research side. Yeah. I think that on the research side, as I said this morning, I think a lot of it's being pushed by younger scholars who are not. Who are impatient about, wanting to get their ideas out there and wanting to have people engaging with their ideas and seeing that with new technologies they're able to do things that their senior colleagues weren't able to do when they were in the same position. So and I think that's all very healthy. On leveraging our alumni networks, so I'm smiling because I love the fact that I was asked this question by somebody from Fletcher, because if a member of my staff were here, they would tell you that since August of 2011, when I started as dean, I have been saying to them over and over, we need to do more to leverage our alumni networks the way Fletcher does with its alumni network. And we're much better at it than we were back in 2011, and so now I'm feeling like maybe we're getting really close. Anyway, we certainly are doing a lot, sort of a whole range of things, as I said, trying to, as I was looking up here. But and I have found it's been great. We have a lot of great SIS alumni in great positions across the United States government, on Capitol Hill, a lot in State Department, other places, and there are a lot of great. They do respond positively when when a faculty member connects with them. They do. Most of them feel positively about the school and do really want to engage and help out. And in fact, a lot of them, many of the faculty members they worked with have retired, and it's a new group of faculty, but they're very interested in learning more about what those new faculty members are doing and what kinds of contributions they can make. So it's a great thing for the schools to really push forward.
Thank you, Jim. Well, in the interests of getting people on their planes in time, Steve's going to get the last word.
Oh, boy, I better be quick then. On the leveraging networks, I just wanted to say that in my checkered career, I've never been turned down by a Fletcher alum that I contacted, just informational interview, whatever. So don't underestimate the goodwill of the alumni network in terms of one-on-one leveraging. On Mike's question, I'll answer one of your questions on this aid conditionality analogy. It's a rather loose conditionality that we have in there, but as I mentioned, the word special consideration, you can define that, interpret that however you'd like.
The IMF uses very similar.
Okay. Oh my God. Well, in terms of the those that are further along, you alluded to some schools that already have that as part of their criteria. Our sense is that those schools will, after touting that they already do that, will come up with something in addition. And those that are perhaps not as far along on that score will then try to address that if they're able to. And then finally, on this issue of ceding credit, I was thinking about, it was Colin Powell who said you get ahead in Washington by not taking credit for things. My own experience, both in Washington and from afar, is that is not always the practice inside the Beltway, but it's an aspiration. Yeah, good point. But it brings up a larger point, and that is this notion of how one measures the impact of activities that, by their very nature, are not something you want to have a Klieg light shining on. And I have to tell you, in the messy world of international peace and security in which I work, it has been a constant challenge because the metrics, the evaluative metrics in this philanthropic field, to be frank, and I'm not saying anything out of school because I've said it publicly and to my colleagues, the field has not kept up with the nuance and sophistication and complexity of this field, however you define it. And we do a lot of work on Track 2 diplomacy, and as you can imagine, the very nature of Track 2 diplomacy is such that you're not going to tout publicly that you had an effect on a particular government or a particular official. And that is a generic challenge across the board. I don't pretend to have the answer, but it's something that those of us working in this sandbox are trying to address in our own modest way. Thank you.
So I've been asked to come up here for no reason whatsoever and hold a Fletcher mug. You can guess potentially why this might be the case, but I just felt like I thought I would hold a mug. But I would like to thank this panel in particular and thank Ian for hosting it. I'd like to thank all the participants for coming up to Boston and informing me. In some ways, this was an entirely selfish conference. It was basically so I could just sit here and listen to everyone. And I actually think I learned a lot. Whether you all learned a lot or not, is you can derive your own conclusions. And I'd also want to thank the Fletcher students that came and the many of whom sat through here and asked really good questions or interacted as well. As I said, this is the first of a series of conferences I hope to hold on this. So hopefully by the end I'll actually have something that'll be worth writing about. But really, thank you one and all. Thanks for coming. And for the people who came, safe travels home. Thanks a lot.
I think it's great. Go ahead, 15 seconds. Are you?